Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most powerful woman in European history who never once sat on a throne and somehow managed to place her grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and various assorted relatives on almost every major throne on the continent. We're talking about Queen Victoria, grandmother of Europe, collector of royal bloodlines, the woman who basically turned marriage into a hostile takeover strategy and made the entire continent her personal family reunion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very warm, sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, the channel wouldn't be what it is without people like you dropping ideas in the comments. Your suggestions genuinely shape what we make here, so thank you. If you haven't already, check us out on Spotify. The link's in the description, right there waiting for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe flip on a fan for that soft white noise, and get yourself settled. Feet under the blanket, head on the pillow. Good. Let's pause for a moment and think about this. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be related to Queen Victoria? Did her grandchildren secretly dread Christmas? Was there a seating chart at family reunions that looked like a map of Europe? Did the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia ever sit at the same dinner table and just glare at each other over the rolls, knowing Grandma had essentially put them both there? Was Victoria actually running Europe from a drawing room in Windsor Castle, just sort of quietly deciding who married whom and letting the consequences handle themselves? Did anyone ever say no to her? Did anyone survive saying no to her? And how exactly does one tiny woman from a minor German duchy end up with her DNA in the veins of nearly every royal family from Britain to Russia to Spain? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1819. The British Empire is already the most powerful force on earth, and somewhere in Kensington Palace, a baby girl has just arrived who will spend the next 81 years quietly reorganizing the entire world. Her name is Alexandrina Victoria. Nobody will call her Alexandrina for long, and you're about to spend a very long, very comfortable night finding out exactly what she did next. Let's start at the very beginning, which in Victoria's case is already strange. Born on the 24th of May, 1819 in Kensington Palace, Victoria arrived into a family that had been scrambling to produce an heir for years. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of King George III, which meant Victoria was roughly fourth in line to get anywhere near the throne. There were heirs ahead of her, there were uncles, there were cousins, there was a whole queue of men who were supposed to handle this. And yet, one by one, through a combination of illness, childlessness, and the general misfortune that seemed to follow the House of Hanover like a personal rain cloud, the path cleared. By the time Victoria was 12, it had become obvious. She was going to be queen. Nobody had really planned for that, least of all Victoria herself, who was being raised in conditions that can only be described as a gilded, suffocating cage with very good curtains. Her father died when she was 8 months old, a cruel twist, even by the standards of a century that was not especially gentle about these things. The Duke of Kent caught a cold on a trip to Devon, and the cold became pneumonia, and that was that. Victoria would grow up with no real memory of him. What she had instead was a mother who was grieving, financially precarious, and entirely dependent on the advice of a man named Sir John Conroy, a man who had grand plans for Victoria's future and very little interest in Victoria's present happiness. The household at Kensington Palace was not warm, it was not playful, it was a project, and Victoria was the project. Imagine growing up knowing you're probably going to be queen, but not being told the exact details. Imagine your every interaction being managed, your friendships selected, your daily schedule approved by committee. Today we would call that a red flag. In 1820-something they called it preparation. Victoria received a reasonably rigorous education, languages, music, history, drawing. She spoke English, German, French, and Italian. She had a governess named Letzen who genuinely loved her, and was one of the few people in her early life who treated her as a child rather than an asset. She had a spaniel named Dash who asked nothing of her and received everything in return. She wrote in her journal with the careful seriousness of someone who suspects, correctly, that history might eventually be paying attention. Meanwhile, the uncles kept dying. George IV died in 1830. William IV had no legitimate surviving children. The machinery of succession ground steadily in one direction. When Victoria was 11, she was shown a genealogical chart that made the situation clear, and she reportedly said quietly that she would be good. Whether she was frightened or resolved or both is impossible to say from this distance. Probably both. That combination, genuine apprehension held very still beneath a composed exterior, would become something of a signature. What nobody fully appreciated in those years of managed isolation and careful preparation was that the system designed to produce a controllable queen was also producing something else entirely. A woman who had spent her entire childhood watching adults try to manipulate her and had learned every move in that particular game. The confinement didn't break Victoria. It educated her in ways her tutors hadn't intended. By the time she was 18, she knew exactly what power looked like when it was being used to keep someone small, because she had been on the receiving end of it for as long as she could remember. The throne was coming, and Victoria, whether she was ready or not, was very ready indeed. Before Victoria could rule anything, she had to survive her own upbringing, and that was no small task. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and a scheming advisor named Sir John Conroy, had devised something they called the Kensington system, which sounds like a management philosophy and functioned roughly like a prison. Victoria was never allowed to be alone. She slept in her mother's room until she was 18. She was not permitted to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. She had no friends her own age. She was watched, monitored, kept deliberately isolated and emotionally controlled, all under the theory that a sheltered, dependent princess would grow into a grateful, manageable queen. It didn't work. What they actually produced, through years of controlled isolation and relentless supervision, was a woman with a spine made of something considerably stronger than royal privilege. Picture your entire childhood with no closed doors, no private thoughts that weren't potentially reported upward, no friendships that hadn't been pre-screened by adults with competing agendas. You couldn't whisper a secret because there was nobody to whisper it to. You couldn't walk to breakfast by yourself because somebody was always holding your hand, not out of affection, but out of policy. The Kensington system was not about love. It was about producing dependency. Conroy's calculation was that a Victoria who had been kept small and frightened would be a Victoria who needed him once she became queen. He would be the power behind the throne. It was, objectively speaking, a plan. It was also a plan with a fairly significant flaw at the centre, which was Victoria herself. Because here is the thing about people raised under control. Some of them break, and some of them bend, and some of them watch very carefully and file everything away. Victoria filed everything away. She observed. She noticed how rooms shifted when certain people walked in. She noticed which of her mother's ladies genuinely liked her and which were reporting to Conroy. She kept a journal from the age of 13, a journal that her mother and Conroy read, which meant Victoria learned to write honestly in one register and strategically in another. That is a sophisticated skill for a teenager. That is the skill of a person who is already playing a longer game than the people around her realise. Conroy also had a theory that Victoria's health was fragile, a theory he seemed suspiciously invested in, and used it to justify keeping her under near constant supervision. when she became genuinely ill with typhoid fever at 16, Conroy reportedly tried to use the moment of her vulnerability to get her to sign a document making him her personal secretary once. She became queen. She refused, while sick. That is not the behaviour of a fragile, dependent girl. That is the behaviour of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of moment to show you what they are made of. She had virtually no companions her own age apart from her half-sister Theodora, who eventually escaped through marriage and wrote Victoria letters from the continent that were, between the lines, basically dispatches from someone who had made it out. Victoria would not make it out for years, but she watched. She waited. She was 18 years old when she became queen, and the first thing she did was ask to be alone for 1 hour. Just 1 hour. She had never had that before. The household that had been designed to produce a manageable queen had instead produced someone who knew exactly how management worked and was done being managed. Conroy's plan failed in the most spectacular way possible. Victoria became queen, declined to appoint him to anything meaningful, and spent the next several decades not thinking about him at all, which was the most thorough revenge available to a constitutional monarch. The morning of the 20th of June, 1837 is one of those moments history remembers in crisp detail, because it is exactly the kind of scene that writes itself. Victoria was 18 years old and asleep in Kensington Palace when the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at 6 in the morning to inform her that King William IV had died, and she was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. She came downstairs in a dressing gown, hair loose, and received them alone. Not with her mother standing beside her. Not with Conroy hovering in the background. Alone. Her journal entry for that morning is famously composed and quietly electric. She wrote that she was young and inexperienced, but that she was resolved to do her duty. What she didn't write, what she didn't need to write, was that, for the first time in her entire life, nobody could tell her what to do. Think about that for a moment. 18 years old, never been alone in a room, never walked downstairs without someone holding your hand. And then, at 6 in the morning, two of the most senior figures in the British establishment kneel before you in a dressing gown and call you Your Majesty. The power didn't arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, in one morning. Like someone had simply flipped a switch labelled Queen. Whatever Victoria felt in that moment, and she was careful, even in her private journal about how much she revealed, she received it with a composure that reportedly impressed the Archbishop considerably. Her first act as Queen was to request an hour alone. Just 1 hour to herself, in a room, with no one in it but her. This request was granted. It had never been granted before. The system that had organised her entire existence around the principle that Victoria must never be unsupervised was over, and Victoria marked its ending by simply standing in a quiet room for 60 minutes. You cannot fully appreciate how radical that was unless you understand what had come before. It was the equivalent of someone who had been running a race in chains reaching the finish line, and the first thing they do is just stand still and breathe. The Privy Council meeting that followed, the formal, official first meeting of Victoria's reign, was attended by men who expected on some level a nervous girl. What they got was a young woman who moved through the ceremonial procedures with assurance, who signed her name clearly, who spoke when required to speak and did not speak when she wasn't, and who gave the assembled lords of Britain the distinct impression that she had been waiting for this and was not remotely afraid of it. The diarist Charles Greville, who was present, wrote that she was as composed as if she'd been doing it all her life. That evening Victoria held her first audience with Lord Melbourne, who had become her Prime Minister and her most important mentor. She had already given her first instruction. Conroy was to be removed from her household. Melbourne received this information without apparent surprise. He'd been watching from a distance for some years, and had formed his own conclusions about what kind of queen Victoria was going to be. He was right about most of them. The girl who had been kept small her whole life had spent the first 12 hours of her reign growing very quickly indeed, and she was not finished yet. Every young ruler needs a mentor, and Victoria found hers in a 60-year-old Whig Prime Minister named Lord Melbourne, who was charming, world-weary, and exactly the kind of figure a lonely, brilliant 18-year-old queen would find irresistible to talk to. Melbourne was everything the Kensington Palace household had never allowed into Victoria's orbit. Witty, relaxed, politically experienced, and genuinely kind. Rode with her in the mornings. He sat beside her at dinner. He explained the mechanics of government with the patience of a man who had seen enough of it to find it faintly amusing. Victoria adored him. She wrote about him in her journal with the barely concealed enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered that adults can actually be interesting. Their relationship was warm, perhaps a little too warm for court gossip to ignore, but entirely proper. A friendship built on mutual respect and the shared project of turning a sheltered teenager into a functioning monarch. Melbourne had lived a complicated life. His wife had famously conducted a spectacular, public, emotionally deranging affair with Lord Byron, the kind of romantic disaster that tends to either destroy a person or give them a very well-developed sense of perspective. Melbourne had come out the other side of it with a dry, gentle view of human nature that Victoria found entirely new. He didn't moralize, he didn't lecture. He observed, and he reported what he observed with a precision that made politics feel like a story rather than a set of rules to be memorized. Victoria, who had spent her whole childhood being given rules, found this revolutionary. He taught her practical things. How to read a parliamentary speech for what it wasn't saying. How to receive a minister who was lying to you without revealing that you knew. How to write a royal letter that communicated authority without overstepping constitutional limits. How to sit through a ceremony that was deeply boring without the boredom showing on your face. A skill that is significantly harder than it sounds, and for which the British monarchy has historically had a remarkable talent. Melbourne was patient with her questions, which were frequent and sometimes naive and always intelligent. He answered them honestly, which was not something Victoria had previously been offered in great supply. The relationship had critics, as most things involving Victoria tended to. Political opponents called her Melbourne's queen, suggesting she was too close to her prime minister, too influenced by Whig politics, too young to be trusted with her own governance. There was something to this. Victoria was, in these early years, genuinely dependent on Melbourne in ways that went beyond the constitutional. She missed him when Parliament was not in session. She consulted him on matters that were not strictly his concern. When, in 1839, the formation of a new government required her to replace some of her Whig ladies-in-waiting with Tory ones, she flatly refused, a constitutional crisis now known as the bedchamber crisis, and Melbourne, who should perhaps have advised her more firmly, allowed it to continue in ways that suggested his own reluctance to step back. But the education Melbourne gave Victoria was real and lasting. By the time her relationship with him faded, as it naturally did, as she grew more confident and he grew older and his government fell, Victoria had become something genuinely different from the girl who had come downstairs in a dressing gown 3 years earlier. She understood Parliament. She understood the press. She understood how to use the symbolic weight of the monarchy to apply pressure without technically violating constitutional norms. Melbourne had given her the tools. What she built with them over the next 6 decades was entirely her own. And then came Albert. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived for a visit in 1839, and Victoria, who had previously been somewhat lukewarm on the idea of marriage, took one look at him and apparently rearranged her entire emotional landscape on the spot. She wrote in her journal that he was beautiful, that his figure was perfect, that she was quite in love with him. For context, this is a woman who had been raised in almost complete social isolation. had never been allowed a close friendship and had spent most of her adolescence under the thumb of adults who wanted to control her. Albert was clever, serious, principled, and deeply in love with her in return. Because Victoria was the queen, protocol required that she propose to him, which she did, reportedly trembling, and he said yes. They were married in February 1840 and proceeded to have 9 children, which is a number that will become very important later in this story. Here is what the official portraits don't tell you. Victoria and Albert were genuinely, almost inconveniently in love with each other. This was not a political marriage that grew into affection. This was an immediate, mutual, somewhat overwhelming romantic attachment that both of them found slightly startling. Victoria, who'd never been allowed to feel anything without it being monitored and interpreted by people with their own agendas, found the experience of being simply and uncomplainingly loved rather overwhelming. Albert, who had grown up in a German court, with its own complications, found in Victoria a partner of matching intelligence and considerably more emotional expressiveness than he had been prepared for. They fought, famously and loudly. Victoria had a temper. Albert had a gift for principled, infuriating calm that made Victoria's temper worse. The arguments were real, and the reconciliations were real, and the whole thing had a heat and texture that formal history tends to iron out. Albert was not immediately popular. The British public viewed him with the particular suspicion reserved for foreign-born consorts, who seemed too clever and too interested in how things work. He had no constitutional role. He had no official title for the first 17 years of his marriage. Victoria's parliament declined to make him king consort, meaning Albert spent nearly 2 decades as the most influential, unofficial person in the British government. He handled this with impressive equanimity, because Albert was, among his other qualities, exceptionally good at playing a long game. Their domestic life was, by the standards of the British royal family, remarkably warm. They were hands-on parents, which was not the fashion among the Victorian aristocracy. Albert organised family theatricals. Victoria drew sketches of the children. They had a home at Balmoral in Scotland and another at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, both designed more for living than for ceremony. Victoria described these places in her journal with a warmth she brought to very little else, and the warmth was genuine. Within the official architecture of empire, she had built something small and private and hers. Albert was the centre of it. He was also the centre of her governance, her ambitions, her self-understanding. When he died, Victoria didn't just lose a husband. She lost the scaffolding around which she had built a version of herself she recognised and valued. Everything that came after, the grief, the withdrawal, the slow rebuilding, was the story of what Victoria was when you took Albert away. The answer turned out to be considerable, but it took her a long time to find out. Here is something the portraits don't quite capture. Albert was, in nearly every practical sense, running a great deal of the British government alongside Victoria, and almost nobody was happy about it. The British public initially found him cold. Politicians found him interfering. The court found his German efficiency quietly threatening. Albert reorganised the royal household, which had been in chaotic, corrupt disarray. He reformed the staff, the finances, the filing systems. He sat beside Victoria while she worked through state papers. He drafted letters, attended meetings, managed correspondence. He was, in modern terms, effectively chief of staff to the most powerful monarch in the world. Victoria leaned on him completely, perhaps too completely, a fact she herself would acknowledge with considerable grief later. But while Albert lived, the partnership worked. Victoria provided the constitutional authority. Albert provided the relentless, disciplined application of it. They were, in the truest sense, a team, and for 21 years they ran an empire from adjacent desks. The household Albert inherited was, by his own description, a mess. royal households in early 19th century Britain operated on systems so layered with tradition and so free of accountability that they had developed their own internal logic entirely disconnected from efficiency or basic common sense. Albert, who was German, and who therefore had very particular feelings about administrative systems, found this intolerable. He reorganized the staff structure, clarified which departments reported to whom, identified and removed a remarkable number of redundant positions, and introduced budgetary controls that saved the royal household significant sums annually. The staff disliked him for most of this. Albert appears to have been largely unconcerned. What Albert also brought, and what proved more consequential in the long run, was intellectual engagement. He was genuinely interested in ideas, in science, in art, in the relationship between industrial progress and social welfare. He was a significant force behind the Great Exhibition of 1851, the enormous international showcase of industry and culture held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, which attracted more than 6 million visitors and established Britain's reputation as the workshop of the world in the most literal possible sense. The Great Exhibition was Albert's vision made physical, the belief that science and cooperation could produce a better world, and its success gave him a credibility with the British public that charm had never managed. He also served as Victoria's political conscience in ways that are easy to underestimate. Victoria had strong opinions and a tendency toward personal loyalty that occasionally clouded political judgment. Albert was cooler, more analytical, more willing to say, with a careful phrasing of a man who understood his constitutional position, that perhaps this particular letter to the Prime Minister might benefit from a second draft. Victoria sometimes disagreed with his restraint. She usually took his advice. The correspondence between them and the marginal notes Albert left on state papers reveal a governing partnership of genuine sophistication conducted in a marriage of genuine love, which is a combination that history doesn't produce especially often. He worked himself, by any reasonable assessment, too hard. His health deteriorated across the 1850s and into the early 1860s. He slept poorly, suffered recurring stomach ailments, and carried a workload that would have been punishing for a man with an official constitutional role, let alone one who was technically just the Queen's husband. Victoria worried. Albert dismissed the worry with the cheerful stoicism of a man who had decided that the alternative to working was worse. He was 42 when he died. Victoria would spend the next 40 years demonstrating, in the most thorough way imaginable, that a person can be both one of the most powerful figures in the world and entirely alone. Now, the 9 children. This is where the story shifts from a Victorian domestic drama into something that looks considerably more like geopolitical chess played with actual human beings. Victoria and Albert had 4 sons and 5 daughters, and from very early on both parents understood that each of these children was not merely a family member, but a diplomatic asset of considerable weight. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Marry the children into the ruling families of Europe, create a web of British-connected royalty across the continent, and thereby extend British influence without a single soldier or warship being deployed. It was the foreign policy equivalent of getting someone to do your work for you, and it worked spectacularly, right up until the moment it didn't, which is a story involving a world war and several of the grandchildren, but we'll get there. To understand the ambition of this project, you have to understand the map of Europe in the 1850s. The continent was a patchwork of kingdoms, empires, duchies, and principalities, many of them related to each other through previous generations of strategic marriage, many of them in various states of tension with their neighbours. Marriage alliances were not new. European royalty had been using them as diplomacy for centuries. What Victoria and Albert added was scale, intentionality, and the particular weight of the British Empire standing behind each match. When a British princess married a German prince, she didn't arrive empty-handed. She arrived trailing the most powerful commercial and naval force on Earth, and everyone in the room knew it. The children themselves were mixed about this arrangement, as children generally are when their emotional lives are treated as instruments of foreign policy. Vicky, the eldest, was sent to Prussia at 17, a brilliant, sensitive girl dropped into one of the most politically brutal courts in Europe and expected to modernize it through sheer force of personality. She was not entirely wrong to try. She was not successful. Her daughter-in-law would have a harder time. Her son would start a war. Alice, the second daughter, went to Germany and died young, but not before passing on a genetic legacy that would haunt the Russian and Spanish royal families for generations. More on that shortly. Helena married a minor German prince and lived a life of comparative obscurity, which by the standards of her siblings was practically a retirement. Louise, the most artistically gifted of the daughters, married a Scottish duke and became the first of Victoria's children to marry a British subject, scandalising the continental establishment and presumably relieving at least one small German duchy. The sons were deployed differently. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, married the Danish Princess Alexandra, a match made partly for alliance purposes and partly because Alexandra was one of the most genuinely charming women in Europe, and even Victoria's advisers felt that Bertie should at least have something nice to look at, given that the rest of his existence was being managed fairly heavily. The younger sons married into various European dynasties, or simply lived out their lives in the comfortable obscurity that being a younger royal child of a reigning monarch generally provides. By the time Victoria died in 1901, her descendants occupied or had married into the ruling houses of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Spain. It was a network of extraordinary breadth, connected at the centre by a small woman in Windsor Castle, who wrote letters to all of them, remembered all of their birthdays, and had opinions about all of their choices that she did not hesitate to share. The network was also, unfortunately, a network, which meant that when parts of it began to pull against each other, the tension ran in every direction at once. On the 14th of December, 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. He was 42 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever, though modern historians have debated other contributing conditions. What is not debatable is what happened to Victoria afterward. She collapsed, not metaphorically. The woman who had been described by foreign ambassadors as formidably composed, who had received prime ministers through assassinations and rebellions and the Indian Mutiny without visibly flinching, simply broke. She wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years. She kept Albert's clothes laid out every morning as if he might still dress. She had a cast made of his hand. She slept with a copy of his hand cast beside her in bed. She withdrew so completely from public life that her subjects began to openly resent her absence, and Republican sentiment briefly flickered in Britain for the first time in decades. Victoria called it her living death. She was not being dramatic. She meant it exactly. To understand what Albert's death meant to Victoria, you have to understand what Albert meant to Victoria, which is something she never adequately explained because she never found words large enough for it. He was her husband. He was her partner in government. He was the first person in her life who had loved her without wanting anything from her. He was the architecture around which she had built her adult self, the counterweight to her emotional intensity, the structure that held the more volatile parts of her personality in productive tension. Without him, she said, she was nothing. This was not false modesty. She genuinely did not know who she was when the person who had helped define her was gone. She was 42 years old, the most powerful monarch in the world and completely lost. The withdrawal was total and, from the perspective of the British government, deeply problematic. Victoria refused to appear in public. She refused to open Parliament. She refused to hold the ceremonial functions that were, constitutionally speaking, not optional. Ministers travelled to Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne to conduct business with a woman in black who sat behind a screen during some audiences to avoid being seen, and who communicated with her cabinet through written notes when she communicated at all. The paperwork continued. Victoria never stopped reading state papers, never stopped signing documents, never stopped writing letters. But the visible, ceremonial Queen had simply stopped appearing, and Britain, which had spent 60 years building its identity around a monarch who was present, found the absence profoundly unsettling. The grief was also, to those around her, frightening in its specific, detailed quality. Victoria did not grieve in the abstract. She grieved in inventories. She slept with a cast of Albert's hand. She had his shaving water brought to his room every morning for years. She wore his miniature portrait around her neck until she died. She talked about him in the present tense. She annotated his letters and organised his papers, and reread his notes to her with the careful attention of someone who is trying to keep a conversation going with a person who has left the room. This was not, by any medical assessment of the time or since, a healthy way to grieve. It was also, perhaps, the only way Victoria knew how to love, completely, with no portion held back for herself. While Victoria grieved, a Scottish Highland servant named John Brown moved into a position of extraordinary personal influence, and Victorian Britain had no idea what to do about it. Brown was blunt to the point of rudeness, indifferent to protocol, and seemingly impervious to the social terror that Victoria inspired in everyone else. He called her woman when she was being difficult. He told her when she was overdressed. He managed her schedule with a combination of loyalty and mild contempt for anyone he felt was wasting her time. Victoria adored him. The court was horrified. Satirical cartoonists had a magnificent few years. Pamphlets circulated suggesting the Queen had secretly married him, which was almost certainly untrue but wonderfully scandalous. What Brown actually provided was simpler and sadder than any of the gossip. He was one of the only people alive who treated Victoria as a person rather than a symbol, and after Albert's death, that was worth more to her than almost anything her empire could offer. Brown had originally been employed as a personal attendant at Balmoral, where Victoria and Albert had spent their happiest family summers. After Albert's death, Victoria's doctors, worried about her health, her isolation, and the degree to which she had stopped moving, suggested she resume riding. Brown was assigned to lead her horse. It was a practical arrangement. It became something considerably more complicated. Brown was, by all accounts, utterly lacking in the particular form of deference that every other person in Victoria's life performed as a matter of survival. He told her what he thought. He told her when her walking was not enough. He told her when her grief was making her difficult. He did this in a broad Scots accent with the manner of a man who had decided at some point that the worst thing that could happen to him was being dismissed from a job he already found somewhat baffling, and that this was not especially frightening. Victoria found this liberating in a way that the more sophisticated attentions of her ministers and courtiers had never managed. Everybody in the official world of the British monarchy was playing a role, performing loyalty, performing deference, performing discretion. Brown was not performing anything. He was simply there, solid and direct and incapable of diplomatic flattery, and in the strange hollowed-out landscape of Victoria's widowhood, that simplicity was extraordinary. The court's discomfort went beyond snobbery, though snobbery was certainly present in large quantities. The practical concern was influence. Brown controlled access to Victoria in ways that made ministers nervous. He decided who saw her and when. He sometimes intercepted correspondence. He held a position of physical proximity to the Queen that had no constitutional name and therefore no constitutional limits, and the people whose job it was to manage the Queen found this arrangement profoundly unsatisfactory. Her son Bertie despised Brown openly. Her daughter Vicky worried from Prussia. The satirical press nicknamed Victoria Mrs. Brown, and the pamphlets were, by the standards of Victorian journalism, fairly unrestrained. Victoria was unmoved by all of it. Brown served her until his death in 1883, and when he died, she mourned him with a completeness that surprised even those who had watched the relationship closely. She wrote a memoir of him. She commissioned a statue. She left instructions that certain mementos were to be buried with her, instructions that were carried out. The widow of Windsor, it turned out, had a considerable capacity for loyalty that went in whatever direction it chose and did not particularly consult the court's opinion on the matter. In 1876, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who had figured out that the best way to manage Victoria was enthusiastic flattery delivered at high frequency, pushed through the Royal Titles Act, and Queen Victoria became Empress of India. She was thrilled. She had never been to India. She would never go to India. But she embraced the title with the energy of someone who had always suspected they were meant for something grander than merely being queen. She began learning Hindustani. She hired an Indian servant named Abdul Karim, whom she called the Munshi, and who promptly became nearly as controversial at court as John Brown had been. She decorated her rooms with Indian artifacts and had herself painted in the style of a Mughal empress. Her courtiers found this baffling. Victoria found their bafflement baffling. She was Empress of India. She was going to act like it. The title was not purely symbolic. Queen was already one of the most powerful designations in the world, but Empress carried a different register, an explicit claim to continental-scale dominance that placed Victoria on equal footing with the Tsar of Russia and the Emperor of Germany. For a woman who had spent 40 years watching European emperors occupy a symbolic tier above the British crown, this mattered. It also mattered to India, or at least to the Indian princes who had been navigating their relationship with the British crown as subjects of a mere queen, and who now found the constitutional architecture of their subordination upgraded to imperial scale. Whether this was an improvement depended entirely on where you were standing. The Munshi arrived in 1887, brought to court as part of Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebrations and assigned initially to serve at table. Within weeks, Victoria had decided he was more interesting than that. Abdul Karim taught her Hindustani. He told her about India, about the food, the customs, the religious traditions, the daily texture of a subcontinent that Victoria governed with great authority and, in terms of direct personal knowledge, almost none. Victoria was fascinated. She made him her Indian secretary. She consulted him on Indian affairs, which drove her government into a quiet fury since Abdul Karim had no formal diplomatic training, and the Indian viceroy's considered dispatches were apparently competing for Victoria's attention with the enthusiastic briefings of a young man from Agra. The court's objections to Abdul Karim ran precisely parallel to their objections to John Brown, which tells you something consistent about Victoria's character. She was drawn to people who were genuinely themselves in her presence, and the genuine self she found most valuable was often the one farthest from the elaborate performance of British aristocratic deference. Both Brown and Karim were dismissed after her death. Karim was sent back to India. His correspondence with Victoria reportedly destroyed or removed by her family, his rooms at Osborne cleared. The pattern is too neat to be comfortable. Victoria had spent her entire life surrounded by people who managed her. The two people she chose for herself were both, immediately after her death, managed away. Benjamin Disraeli understood something about Victoria that most of her prime ministers never quite grasped. She wanted to be treated as a partner in government, not as a constitutional formality to be managed. He sent her flowers. He wrote her long, entertaining letters about parliamentary proceedings in the style of a novelist rather than a bureaucrat. He called her the Fairy Queen. He told her the business of politics in ways that made her feel not merely informed but involved. Victoria, who had spent decades being either idolised or ignored, found this intoxicating. She made him Earl of Beaconsfield. She visited him when he was ill, which a British monarch essentially never does for a prime minister. Their relationship was one of the great political odd couples of the 19th century. A Jewish novelist turned statesman and a grieving German-descended empress who wanted, more than anything, to feel that she still mattered. Disraeli made her feel that. Gladstone, his great rival, had absolutely no idea how to do this and suffered the consequences for decades. Disraeli's background was unlike anyone else who had ever held the office of British Prime Minister. He had been born Jewish, converted to Christianity as a child, written a string of novels of variable quality and considerable ambition, run up debts that followed him like a personal weather system, and clawed his way to the top of the Conservative Party through a combination of wit, audacity, and a talent for parliamentary theatre that his opponents found infuriating and his supporters found irresistible. He was, in short, an outsider who had made himself indispensable to an establishment that had never quite decided whether to admire or distrust him, and he understood from personal experience what it felt like to be underestimated. This gave him a particular sensitivity to Victoria's situation that her other ministers lacked. Victoria was a woman in a world of men. She was a monarch in a constitutional system that was steadily, carefully reducing the practical power of monarchs. She was a widow in a court that was always performing for someone else's comfort. She wanted to be seen and taken seriously, and the men around her, with the best intentions, kept managing her instead. Disraeli simply refused to manage her. He engaged her. He asked her opinions. He incorporated her suggestions into actual policy, with a theatrical ceremony that may have been partly performance, but was entirely effective. Victoria knew at some level that Disraeli was managing her through the appearance of not managing her. She didn't care. The experience of being treated as an intelligent adult by a prime minister was sufficiently novel that she was willing to enjoy it without examining it too closely. The Empress of India title was Disraeli's gift to her, and he delivered it with the timing of a man who had spent his entire career understanding that political gift must be wrapped correctly. He didn't present it as a constitutional adjustment. He presented it as recognition, long overdue recognition of what Victoria already was, the Fairy Queen, the mother of empire, the living symbol of British civilization at its most expansive. Victoria, who had not received a genuine compliment about her constitutional position since Albert died, received this one with visible emotion. Disraeli noted privately that he had found the key that unlocked the Queen, and that the key was simply treating her as someone worth unlocking. He died in 1881, and Victoria sent primroses to his funeral, his favourite flower, and wore them herself in mourning. She visited his house at Hughenden after his death, and sat in the room where he had worked. She wrote in her journal that she had lost her best and most devoted minister. She had also lost, though she may not have framed it this way, the one person in British politics who had consistently made her feel powerful at a time when her power was increasingly symbolic. That was not nothing. In a life full of losses, it was a particular kind. William Ewart Gladstone served as Victoria's Prime Minister 4 times, which is roughly 4 times more than Victoria wanted. She found him exhausting, preachy, and insufferably earnest. He addressed her, she famously complained, as if she were a public meeting. He delivered lengthy moral lectures on Irish policy and electoral reform and the duties of constitutional monarchy, without apparently noticing the increasingly frozen expression on the face of the woman he was lecturing. Victoria was not philosophically opposed to liberal reform, She was opposed to being talked at. Gladstone never understood this. He kept trying to explain things to her. Victoria kept trying to get him out of Downing Street. For 30 years they circled each other in a state of polite, deteriorating mutual exasperation that courtiers described with the diplomatic language of people who knew better than to say what they actually thought. Gladstone was, by any objective measure, one of the greatest parliamentarians Britain has ever produced. He was brilliant, principled, hard-working, and deeply, genuinely concerned with the moral improvement of the nation and the welfare of its people. He read voraciously, slept a little, chopped down trees for physical exercise, and approached every political question with the focused seriousness of a man who believed that governance was a sacred responsibility. He was also, in personal interaction, essentially impossible. Not cruel, he was not unkind, but he was incapable of lightness. He could not make small talk without turning it into a lecture. He could not write a letter without it becoming an essay. He could not enter a room without making it feel like a parliamentary debate was about to begin. Victoria, who had spent her formative years being controlled and lectured by people who thought they knew better than her, had developed a very specific allergy to being talked at by men who were certain of their own righteousness. Gladstone was certainty given human form. He was also inclined to be correct, which made the whole thing considerably worse. There is nothing more aggravating than a person who is both insufferable and right, and Victoria found herself in this situation for the better part of 3 decades. Their conflicts were real and consequential. On Ireland, where Gladstone believed passionately in Home Rule, and Victoria believed equally passionately that the Empire could not afford the precedent, they were genuinely, substantively opposed. On military matters, where Victoria's instincts were more interventionist than Gladstone's careful liberalism preferred, they fought through letters of escalating diplomatic strain. On the question of how much influence the monarch should have over the formation of governments, they had a running constitutional argument that was never quite resolved. Gladstone believed in the letter of constitutional monarchy. Victoria believed in a somewhat more expansive interpretation. She wrote to her family about him with a freedom she never used in official correspondence, calling him dangerous, exhausting, impossible, a man who would ruin the empire with his principles. Gladstone, for his part, wrote about Victoria with the careful respect of a man who had decided that discretion was the better part of survival, and who understood that the Queen would outlast him, as she outlasted everyone. He was right. When he finally left office for the last time in 1894, he was 84 years old, and Victoria did not ask him to stay. She did not thank him extensively. She offered him a peerage, which he declined. They parted as they had always conducted their relationship, with full constitutional propriety and the absolute minimum of warmth. Victoria's eldest daughter, also named Victoria but known as Vicky, married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia in 1858, and this was the first thread in what would become the most consequential family network in modern European history. Vicky was brilliant, arguably the most intellectually gifted of Victoria's children, which is saying something in a family that included some genuinely formidable minds. She had absorbed both her parents' liberal values and her father Albert's reforming instincts, and she arrived in Prussia convinced she could modernise the place. Prussia, which was in the process of becoming Germany, and doing so with considerable violence and nationalism, was not especially interested in being modernised by a British princess. Vicky's marriage became a long, slow collision between her ideals and the political reality of Bismarck's Prussia, and it produced, among other things, a son named Wilhelm who would grow into one of the most catastrophically complicated figures of the 20th century. Vicky left England at 17. She was clever, passionate, opinionated, and trained from childhood to believe that liberal values and enlightened governance were not merely preferences but moral obligations. Albert had poured considerable intellectual energy into her education, more, arguably, than into any of his other children, in the belief that a British princess installed in Prussia could, over time, gently steer the most powerful state in continental Europe toward constitutional liberalism. It was an ambitious theory. It collided almost immediately with Otto von Bismarck, which is the geopolitical equivalent of a theory colliding with a brick wall. The Prussian court was everything the British court was not. Where Victoria's household ran on a combination of constitutional precedent and Victorian propriety, the Prussian court ran on military hierarchy, dynastic pride, and a form of nationalism that had very little interest in being moderated by anyone, least of all an English girl with progressive opinions. Vicky was treated with a blend of formal courtesy and quiet condescension that became, over the years, less quiet and less courteous. Her ideas were dismissed. Her influence was contained. Her husband Frederick was a genuinely decent man who shared many of her values, but he occupied a position in the Prussian military hierarchy that made acting on those values nearly impossible. Their correspondence with Victoria, long, frequent, painfully honest letters that form one of the most remarkable family archives of the 19th century, reads like a decades-long conversation between two women who understood the machinery of patriarchal power from the inside, and were trying, from their respective positions, to find the levers. Victoria advised. Vicky reported. The reports became increasingly bleak. Bismarck was consolidating. Prussia was becoming Germany through a series of wars that Vicky found morally troubling, and her mother found constitutionally alarming. The liberal Germany that Albert had imagined, and that Vicky had gone there to help build, was not the Germany that was actually being constructed. And then there was the son. Wilhelm was Vicky's firstborn, delivered in a traumatic birth that left him with a permanently damaged left arm and, Vicky always suspected, though she could never say it directly, some neurological consequences that shaped his temperament in ways that made him difficult to love and impossible to manage. She tried. She tried with the relentless, anxious intensity of a woman who understood what was at stake and could see from very early on that the boy was not becoming what she had hoped. He resented her. He adored his grandmother Victoria, who had a talent for managing him that his own mother never found. He became Kaiser, and the rest, as they say, is the first half of the 20th century. Victoria's grandson Wilhelm became Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany in 1888, and almost immediately began demonstrating that being the grandson of the most powerful woman in Europe did not guarantee political wisdom. Wilhelm was brilliant, erratic, deeply insecure, and possessed of an ego that required almost continuous external reinforcement to stay stable. He had a withered left arm from a difficult birth, which historians have suggested contributed to a lifelong need to prove himself in ways that were frequently dangerous. He adored his grandmother Victoria and resented his mother Vicky in roughly equal measure. He admired Britain deeply and envied it constantly, which is a psychologically unstable combination. Victoria herself found him exhausting and was one of the few people who could occasionally make him behave. After she died in January 1901, that particular restraint was gone. The consequences took about 13 years to fully detonate. Wilhelm came to power in what became known as the Year of Three Emperors, 1888, which sounds like the premise of a very dramatic novel, and was essentially exactly that. His grandfather Wilhelm I died in March. His father Frederick, Vicky's husband, and the liberal hope of a generation, became Kaiser while already dying of throat cancer. Frederick reigned for 99 days. He died in June. Wilhelm, who was 29, became Kaiser in the same year he lost both his grandfather and his father, and within months had dismissed Bismarck, the man who had built the German state, with the casual confidence of someone who had not yet learned that confidence requires a foundation. Dismissing Bismarck was, in retrospect, one of the more consequential personnel decisions in modern European history. Bismarck was many things: authoritarian, ruthless, a man whose methods Vicky had spent 30 years opposing, but he was also an extraordinarily skilled manager of the competing pressures that made European peace possible. He understood that German power needed to be exercised with restraint, that the other great powers needed to feel that Germany could be worked with, that alliance and balance were the mechanisms that kept the continent from tearing itself apart. Wilhelm found this caution unexciting. He was the Kaiser. Germany was the most powerful state in Europe. He was going to act like it. Victoria watched Wilhelm's early reign with an anxiety she communicated in letters to Vicky and in audiences with her ministers that grew progressively more pointed. She had a grandmother's particular access to him, the ability to say things directly that nobody else dared to say, and she used it, writing to him with a frankness that combined royal authority with the specific moral weight of a grandmother who is disappointed but has not given up. Wilhelm received these letters with the mixture of genuine love for his grandmother and genuine impatience with her interference that characterized his relationship with most people who tried to moderate him. After Victoria died, the moderating influence died with her. Vicky followed her mother to the grave within months. She'd been diagnosed with breast cancer while Victoria was still alive and kept it private, not wanting to add to her mother's grief, which is the kind of detail that history offers occasionally to remind you that behind the geopolitical machinery are actual people in actual pain. Wilhelm was now the Kaiser of Germany with no grandmother to write to him and no mother he would listen to. The road to 1914 was not straight or inevitable, but it ran through a man who had spent his life measuring himself against an empire he could never quite be, and a family he could never quite satisfy. And that particular combination of ambition and inadequacy tends, historically, not to end quietly. Victoria carried a genetic mutation for haemophilia, a blood clotting disorder that, in its severe form, means a minor injury can become life-threatening. She herself was unaffected, as was Albert, but the gene passed silently through her daughters and granddaughters, emerging with devastating consequences in the sons they bore. Victoria's daughter Alice passed it to her daughter Alex, who married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and became Tsarina Alexandra. Their son, Tsarevich Alexei, was born with haemophilia. His suffering became the opening through which a Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin walked into the Russian imperial court, because Rasputin could, through means nobody had ever satisfactorily explained, calm the boy's bleeding episodes. The Tsarina's desperate gratitude gave Rasputin extraordinary influence over the Russian court. That influence helped destabilize the Romanov dynasty. The Romanov dynasty's collapse helped produce the Russian Revolution. It is not a straight line from Victoria's genes to the Soviet Union, but it is a line, and it runs through a Siberian mystic and a small, suffering boy, which is the kind of historical footnote that makes you stare at the ceiling for a while. Alice was Victoria's third child, gentle, compassionate, and possessed of a warmth that made her perhaps the most immediately likeable of Victoria's daughters in the accounts that survive her. She married Prince Ludwig of Hesse in 1862, just months after Albert's death, in a ceremony Victoria described as more like a funeral than a wedding. Alice had nursed her father in his final illness with a devotion that her mother never forgot and always acknowledged. She had also been the one who, at Albert's deathbed, told Bertie that his father was dying, a task that fell to her because nobody else would do it. Alice was, in short, the kind of person who does the difficult thing because it needs doing, and the world is generally not especially kind to those people in return. She died in 1878 of diphtheria at 35. Before she died, she passed the haemophilia gene to her daughter Alex, without either of them knowing it existed. The science of genetic inheritance was not yet established. Victoria knew that the bleeding disorder appeared in her family. Several of her sons and grandsons were affected, but the mechanism was invisible and the mathematics were not yet available to track it. Alex grew up in Hesse, came to Russia, converted to Orthodoxy, and became Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of Russia. She was devoted, intelligent, and deeply, fatally convinced that God had ordained her husband's absolute authority at precisely the moment in history when absolute authority was becoming impossible to sustain in Russia. When Alexei was born in 1904 and the haemophilia became apparent, Alexandra's world contracted around her son's suffering. She tried every treatment available. She prayed with the intensity of a woman who had staked her theology on the belief that faith could move things. And then Rasputin arrived, and Rasputin could help, or appeared to help, or helped in ways that medicine cannot fully explain even now, and Alexandra's gratitude had no constitutional limits. A Siberian peasant mystic was given access to the Russian empress. The Russian court watched with a horror it could not translate into action. The Romanovs were executed in 1918. The connection between Victoria's genes and that cellar in Yekaterinburg is long and indirect, and passes through years of political failure that cannot be reduced to a single cause. But the thread is there, and it begins with a mutation in a woman who died believing she was building a peaceful Europe. Victoria's eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, universally known as Bertie, was a source of more or less continuous maternal anxiety for approximately 60 years. He was not interested in the things Victoria and Albert valued. He was not bookish, not disciplined, not particularly interested in constitutional reform or the moral improvement of the British people. He was interested in horse racing, hunting, food. He was legendarily fond of food, women, card games, and the general pleasures of an aristocratic life lived at high velocity. Victoria blamed herself for his character, then blamed him, then went back to blaming herself. She kept him away from government papers well into his middle age, convinced he would either misuse the information or lose it at a card table. Bertie eventually became Edward VII at the age of 59 and surprised everyone, including his mother, by being rather good at it. But the decades of maternal distrust had done their damage, and the relationship between Victoria and her heir was one of the saddest subplots in an otherwise eventful reign. Albert and Victoria had approached their children's education with the focused seriousness of two people who understood that the future of an empire depended at least partly on the quality of its monarch. For Bertie, this translated into a program of rigorous academic instruction, moral guidance, and carefully managed exposure to improving experiences that was, by any reasonable assessment, extremely unpleasant to be the subject of. Bertie was not Albert. He was not studious, not philosophical, not drawn to the reforming, disciplined vision of monarchy that his parents had spent their marriage constructing. He liked people. He liked pleasure. He liked being the most popular person in a room, which he reliably was, because Bertie had a gift for warmth and social ease that neither of his parents particularly possessed. Albert died partly convinced that Bertie had contributed to his decline. The specific story involves Bertie's first sexual liaison, discovered by Albert, who travelled to Cambridge in the rain to address it with his son, and returned unwell and never recovered. This is almost certainly not the actual cause of Albert's death, but the fact that Victoria believed it for years, and she did believe it, with the specific enduring quality that grief gives to blame, shaped everything that followed. She did not cut Bertie off exactly. She loved him, but she held him at a particular distance, a distance made of old grief and older disappointment, and neither of them ever quite closed it. Bertie spent 40 years as Prince of Wales, the longest apprenticeship in British royal history, performing the ceremonial duties his mother refused to perform while being denied access to the actual business of governance. He attended state functions, he opened buildings, he represented Britain at foreign courts with a social grace that made him enormously popular across Europe, and virtually no one in his mother's household wanted to admit was actually useful. He accumulated an extraordinary network of European relationships, personal friendships with kings and presidents and bankers and artists that would prove diplomatically significant when he finally became king at 59. Victoria had kept him waiting so long that by the time he got there, he already knew everyone. The apprenticeship, however unintentional, had worked. It had just been designed to fail. Victoria survived 8 assassination attempts over the course of her reign, which is a statistic that tends to surprise people because it's the kind of thing that seems like it should come up more often in history lessons. The first happened in 1840, when she was barely a year into her reign and pregnant with her first child. A young man named Edward Oxford fired 2 pistols at her carriage. He missed. Victoria's response, according to observers, was to remain composed and continue her drive through Hyde Park. This established a pattern. Over the following decades, various aggrieved, unstable, or simply confused young men attempted to shoot, strike, or otherwise harm her, and Victoria met each incident with the same combination of genuine courage and mild irritation. She was shot at. She was struck with a cane. A pistol was pressed against her in her carriage. Each time she survived. Each time she seemed almost more bothered by the disruption to her schedule than by the mortal danger. Her subjects found this enormously reassuring, which was probably the point. Edward Oxford was 17 years old when he fired at Victoria's carriage in Green Park in June 1840. He fired twice. Both shots missed. He was wrestled to the ground by bystanders, tried, acquitted on grounds of insanity, and eventually emigrated to Australia, where he reportedly became a respectable member of society, which is one of history's more anticlimactic epilogues. Victoria, who was pregnant at the time, reported the incident to her household with the tone of someone describing a minor traffic inconvenience and went about her afternoon. The second attempt came in 1842, and then a third the same year. 2 separate individuals, both firing pistols, both missing, both arrested. There was a brief, darkly practical discussion within the government about whether Victoria might be used as bait to catch would-be assassins. A proposal that combined genuine ingenuity with a fairly cavalier attitude toward the Queen's personal safety. Victoria was apparently willing to consider it, which tells you something about her particular brand of courage, which was less the dramatic, heroic kind and more the quietly stubborn, "this is not going to stop me" kind. In 1849, an Irish nationalist named William Hamilton fired a blank-loaded pistol at her carriage. In 1850, a retired army lieutenant named Robert Pate struck her across the head with his cane in a crowd outside Cambridge House, giving her a bruised face and a headache. Victoria attended the opera that evening. In 1872, a 17-year-old named Arthur O'Connor pressed an unloaded pistol against her in her carriage and demanded the release of Fenian prisoners, and was apparently surprised when the footman John Brown physically threw him to the ground and sat on him. The final attempt came in 1882, when a man named Roderick McLean fired at her train at Windsor Station and was stopped, accurately, by 2 Eton students with umbrellas. The students received a letter of thanks from the Queen. The umbrellas were not mentioned. What the attempts collectively reveal is both the genuine danger of the job and the degree to which Victoria refused to let danger reshape her behaviour. She continued riding in open carriages long after her security advisers would have preferred she stop. She appeared in public consistently, and without the kind of fortress-level protection that modern heads of state consider standard. The courage was real, but it was also strategic. A queen who hid was a queen who lost something essential about the symbolic weight of monarchy. and Victoria understood this with a clarity that her experience of near death apparently did nothing to diminish. The British Empire in Victoria's time encompassed roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and a similar proportion of its population, and India was its jewel, or rather, the jewel the British had taken and then gotten very attached to. Victoria's relationship with India was complex in ways she herself may not have fully appreciated. She genuinely believed in paternalistic benevolence toward her Indian subjects. She learned phrases in Hindustani. She was outraged by reports of British officials behaving with casual cruelty toward Indians, and occasionally said so to the relevant people. She also presided over a system of colonial extraction that produced famines, denied self-governance to hundreds of millions of people, and administered justice through a framework built entirely for British benefit. These two facts coexisted in Victoria's mind without apparent difficulty, which tells you something about the 19th century, and perhaps also about the particular variety of cognitive flexibility required to run an empire. India came under direct British Crown control in 1858, following the Indian Rebellion of the previous year, an event that British history called the Mutiny, and Indian history called something considerably more complex. Before 1858, India had been administered by the East India Company, a private trading operation that had gradually accumulated governmental powers of extraordinary scope, and was now, following the rebellion, being absorbed into the formal machinery of the British state. Victoria issued a proclamation to the people of India at the moment of this transition that was, by the standards of colonial documents, remarkably measured, promising respect for religious traditions, equal treatment under law, and the continuation of rights and privileges. The proclamation meant different things in practice than it did on paper. Most such proclamations do. Victoria was genuinely interested in India, in the way that a person can be genuinely interested in a place they have never visited and are unlikely to visit, and about which their information is filtered through the accounts of administrators with their own interests to protect. She collected Indian artifacts, decorated her rooms with them, wore Indian jewellery, and developed an aesthetic appreciation for the subcontinent that was real, even when it was also profoundly selective. The India of Victoria's imagination was a place of ancient beauty and exotic tradition, requiring the civilizing guidance of British administration. The India that actually existed included 250 million people with their own sophisticated civilizations, their own governance traditions, and their own increasingly pointed opinions about being administered by people who had arrived uninvited and declined to leave. The famines are the place where the contradiction becomes hardest to look at. Multiple catastrophic famines struck India during Victoria's reign in the 1860s, the 1870s, and the 1890s, killing tens of millions of people. The famines were not entirely natural events. British trade policies, railway priorities, and administrative decisions shaped their severity in ways that historians have argued about extensively, and that the Victorian government argued about at the time, with a combination of genuine concern and a structural inability to prioritise Indian lives over British economic interests. Victoria expressed distress about the famines. The policies that contributed to them continued. The empire that bore her name did both things simultaneously, as empires tend to do. In 1897, Victoria celebrated 60 years on the throne with the Diamond Jubilee, and the British Empire decided to mark the occasion by essentially performing itself at maximum volume for an extended period of time. Troops from every corner of the empire paraded through London. Representatives of subject peoples from Canada to Ceylon marched in the procession. The streets were packed with crowds whose scale photographers struggled to capture with the technology available to them. Victoria, who was 78 years old, rode in an open carriage through streets so densely filled with cheering, people that the sound was described as a physical pressure. She cried, She wrote in her journal that it was an immense success. She was not wrong. For one day in June, the British Empire was a spectacle of almost incomprehensible scale, and at the centre of it was a small, stout, elderly woman in black who had been doing this job since before most of the people cheering for her were born. The planning for the Diamond Jubilee began well before the day itself, and the colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain, a man who believed in the empire with a fervour that occasionally alarmed even his colleagues, had the specific idea of making the Jubilee a demonstration of imperial unity rather than simply a British domestic celebration. Colonial prime ministers were invited. Colonial troops were brought to London. The procession through the city on the 22nd of June would include soldiers from every corner of British Dominion: Canadians, Australians, South Africans, Indians, Cypriots, Borneo Dayak headhunters whose presence in Pall Mall caused a certain amount of excited commentary in the press. The empire would not merely be referenced at the Jubilee, it would be physically present, marching down streets lined with millions of people, reminding everyone watching that the small island hosting the celebration somehow governed a quarter of the planet. Victoria had not been expected to live this long. She had not, frankly, been expected by many of her subjects to recover fully from Albert's death. The long withdrawal of the 1860s had left a generation of Britons unsure whether they still had a functional monarch. The Golden Jubilee of 1887 had begun the rehabilitation, and the decade between had seen Victoria emerge with a vigour and public presence that surprised people who had written her off. By 1897 she was a figure of extraordinary symbolic power, not because she was actively wielding political authority, which had reduced over 60 years, but because she had simply been there, consistently and recognisably, for longer than anyone could remember. She'd become, in a genuine sense, permanent, and permanence, in a century of revolution and change, was its own form of power. The procession itself lasted 2 hours. Victoria rode without a roof over her carriage, a decision her doctors and security advisers found alarming, and Victoria found obvious. Sunstroke was a minor risk compared to the symbolic cost of a queen who rode to her own Jubilee undercover. The crowds pushed so close to the procession route that the horses of the escort were almost pressed against the carriage. Somewhere in the noise, according to several accounts, Victoria bowed her head and prayed quietly for a moment. A private gesture visible to no one, inside a public spectacle visible to millions. That particular combination, the absolute publicity and the absolute privacy maintained simultaneously, was possibly the defining skill of Victoria's reign, and on the day of the Diamond Jubilee she demonstrated it one more time with the practised ease of someone who'd been doing it for 60 years. Victoria's granddaughter, Alice of Hesse, the daughter of Alice, who was Victoria's daughter, married the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, in 1894, just weeks after Victoria's son-in-law died, and in the immediate shadow of Tsar Alexander III's own death. It was, by any measure, an inauspicious beginning to a reign. Nicholas and Alexandra, Alex took the name Alexandra upon conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, were deeply, genuinely in love, which was somewhat unusual for royalty, and not especially helpful for governance. Nicholas was decent, kind, and catastrophically unsuited to be an autocrat ruling a country the size of a continent at the beginning of the 20th century. Alexandra was strong-willed, intensely religious, and utterly convinced that God had ordained her husband's absolute authority. Together they made decisions that historians have spent more than a century analysing with increasing degrees of despair. Nicholas II came to power not through preparation but through sudden death. His father Alexander III had been a physically imposing, politically blunt Tsar, who had ruled with sufficient authority that nobody had felt the need to prepare his heir very carefully. Nicholas was 26 when Alexander died, and his reported response to the news that he was not ready, that he did not know how to rule, that he had never been taught, was both honest and, as statements about the beginning of a reign go, ominous. Russia in 1894 was an empire of extraordinary scale and extraordinary fragility, vast in territory, powerful in military terms, but economically backwards, politically rigid, and building toward the kind of social pressure that tends, historically, to resolve itself in one of two ways. Alexandra arrived from Hesse into this situation with a German princess's education, a convert's fierce Russian orthodoxy, and a personality that combined genuine warmth in private with a public manner so formal and reserved that the Russian court found her cold, and the Russian people, who loved spectacle and accessibility in their czars, found her alien. She was not cold, she was shy, and shy people in positions that demand public performance tend to be misread badly. She was also, like Victoria, possessed of a strong will and a deep conviction that she was right, which is a useful quality in someone with clear authority, and a dangerous one in someone whose authority depends on successfully managing people who disagree. Their marriage was genuinely loving and genuinely isolated. Nicholas and Alexandra preferred each other's company to almost anyone else's, which is admirable in a marriage and catastrophic in a governing partnership that required wide counsel, broad alliances, and the ability to hear uncomfortable truths from people whose company you had not specifically chosen. They had 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son, Alexei, whose haemophilia became the central tragedy of the reign. Victoria had met Nicholas and approved of him, had watched Alex's match with cautious optimism, and had died before the full dimensions of what was coming became clear. It is perhaps as well that she did. The Russia that executed her granddaughter and great-grandchildren in 1918 was not a Russia she would have recognized, and not a consequence she would have known how to hold. Victoria's granddaughter, Victoria Eugenie, known as Ina, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906, and on their wedding day, an anarchist threw a bomb at their carriage. This was not an auspicious beginning, but it was in keeping with the general tone of the reign. Ina had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism to marry Alfonso, which cost her the affection of her grandmother's court and did not especially endear her to the Spanish people, who were suspicious of foreign queens as a general principle. She also carried the haemophilia gene, which she passed to 2 of her sons, a discovery that caused Alfonso to blame her publicly and privately for the rest of their marriage, in ways that would be breathtaking in their cruelty if they were not so depressingly predictable. Ina outlived Alfonso, the Spanish monarchy's first collapse, a civil war, and a Franco dictatorship, dying in 1969, having seen more of the 20th century than most people would have chosen to witness. The wedding bombing of the 31st of May, 1906, killed or wounded more than 100 people in the street outside. The carriage carrying Ina and Alfonso was splattered with blood from the horses ahead of them. Ina arrived at the royal palace for her wedding reception in a blood-stained dress, reportedly composed in the specific way that people are composed when they are operating on shock and training simultaneously. Alfonso, accounts suggest, was considerably less composed. The bomb had been thrown by a Catalan anarchist named Mateu Moral, who subsequently shot himself when cornered. The investigation revealed that the attack had been months in planning. The Spanish security apparatus had known something was coming and had not managed to stop it. Ina, who had given up her religion, her country, and her grandmother's approval to be there, had nearly died before the marriage was an hour old. She stayed anyway. The haemophilia revelation unfolded over the following years as it became clear that 2 of Ina and Alfonso's sons, Alfonso and Gonzalo, had inherited the disorder. The Spanish court's response was to treat this as Ina's personal failure, which tells you something consistent and depressing about how European royal establishments handled the consequences of Victoria's genetic legacy. Alfonso blamed his wife openly. He was unfaithful with a consistency that he apparently did not feel required concealment. Ina endured this with a dignity that her letters suggest cost her considerably more than it appeared to cost. She had no Victoria to write to. Her grandmother had been dead for 5 years by the time the marriage began, and the support structure that Victoria had provided, however imperfect, for her other grandchildren simply was not there. The Spanish monarchy collapsed in 1931. Alfonso went into exile. Ina followed, then separated from Alfonso, then outlived him by nearly 3 decades. She lived to see her grandson Juan Carlos eventually restore the Spanish monarchy in 1975, a restoration she did not quite survive to witness formally, but was alive to know was coming. The granddaughter of the woman who had wanted to use marriage to stabilize Europe had spent her life navigating the specific instability that project had produced. She died in Lausanne, Switzerland, in 1969 at 81, exactly the age Victoria had been when she died, which is the kind of coincidence history occasionally produces, apparently just to see if anyone is paying attention. Otto von Bismarck was the Iron Chancellor of the German Empire, the architect of modern Germany, and the most formidable political mind of the 19th century. Victoria thought he was awful. Bismarck's opinion of Victoria was expressed in the kind of diplomatic language that means approximately the same thing. The two operated at cross purposes for decades. Victoria through her daughter Vicky, who shared her liberal values and loathed Bismarck's methods, and Bismarck through his complete control of the Prussian and later German political apparatus. When Vicky's husband Frederick became Kaiser in 1888, it appeared that Victoria's vision of a liberal Germany might finally have a chance. Frederick was dying of throat cancer when he took the throne. He reigned for 99 days. Bismarck outlasted him. When Wilhelm II took power, Bismarck thought he could manage the young Kaiser, and Wilhelm thought he could dismiss the old Chancellor, and both of them were partly right, which is how you end up with the Europe of the 1890s. Bismarck had built Germany through 3 wars in 7 years, against Denmark, Austria and France, with a strategic precision that his contemporaries found simultaneously admirable and terrifying. He understood power as a system of carefully managed tensions, and he managed those tensions with the attention of a man who knew that the alternative to management was catastrophe. His domestic politics were authoritarian. His foreign policy was, paradoxically, one of the most stability-oriented Europe had seen in generations, not because Bismarck was peaceful by nature, but because he understood that a Germany that frightened all of its neighbours simultaneously would eventually produce a coalition that Germany could not withstand. Victoria understood almost none of this, or rather more precisely, she understood it through the filter of what it had done to her daughter. Bismarck had humiliated Vicky. He had contained Frederick. He had manoeuvred the liberal wing of Prussian politics into irrelevance while building a Germany that was powerful, unified, and constitutionally designed to keep the military and the Chancellor in charge. To Victoria, this was personal before it was political, an enemy of her daughter's happiness who had also managed to be the architect of the most powerful state in Europe, which was an aggravating combination. She wrote about him in her letters with a controlled disgust that occasionally broke into something more direct. Bismarck's view of Victoria was the view of a man who found sentimental liberalism intellectually incoherent, and who had spent 30 years watching the British Queen attempt to conduct German policy through the medium of her daughters. Marriage. He was not wrong about what Victoria was trying to do, he was simply unwilling to allow it. The confrontation between them was never direct. A constitutional monarch and a chancellor of a foreign power do not typically square off openly, but it ran through every major decision of the 1870s and 1880s, like a current beneath the diplomatic surface. Victoria wanted a liberal Germany connected to Britain through the bonds of family and shared values. Bismarck wanted a powerful Germany connected to nobody through bonds of any kind that he had not personally approved and could not personally revoke. Bismarck was dismissed by Wilhelm in 1890. He retired to his estate and spent his remaining years writing memoirs that were, by all accounts, extremely pointed. Victoria outlived him by 3 years. Neither of them in the end got the Europe they wanted. Victoria's network of family peace shattered in 1914, and Bismarck's carefully balanced alliance system collapsed almost immediately after he left the room. It is tempting to conclude that both of them were right about what Europe needed and wrong about how to achieve it, which is precisely the kind of conclusion that history offers when it is being particularly unhelpful. Victoria kept a journal for most of her life, beginning at the age of 13 and continuing almost until her death. It runs to roughly 40,000 pages across 141 volumes. She also wrote an estimated 60,000 letters over the course of her reign, to prime ministers, to foreign heads of state, to her children, to her grandchildren, to John Brown, to Abdul Karim, to friends, to enemies, and to assorted relatives across the continent who received communications from Windsor Castle, with a mixture of pride and what must occasionally have been genuine dread. The journals and letters that survive, her daughter Beatrice destroyed significant portions of the journals after Victoria's death, presumably acting on instructions, reveal a woman of considerable emotional intensity, sharp political instinct, occasional pettiness, genuine warmth, and a capacity for both deep loyalty and prolonged detailed grievance. She was, in short, a very complicated person who happened to be running the world's largest empire. The journal is the more intimate document, and what survives of it reads with a texture that the official portraits entirely omit. Victoria was funny, not in the polished, performed way of someone who understands that wit is a useful social tool, but in the immediate, slightly startled way of someone who notices absurdity and cannot quite suppress the response to it. She described politicians with a dry precision that her public correspondence carefully avoided. She recorded meals, music, the behaviour of her dogs, the appearance of visiting dignitaries, the weather at Balmoral, and the small domestic details of daily life with the same careful attention she brought to state affairs. The journal was not a political document. It was the record of a person living a life, and the person living it was considerably more vivid than the constitutional monarch she performed in public. The letters are something else, a 50-year conversation conducted in multiple directions simultaneously, in a hand that remained clear and forceful well into old age. Victoria wrote fast and she wrote often, and she wrote with the assumption that the people she was writing to understood both what she meant and what she had deliberately left out. The letters to her children are the most emotionally complex, simultaneously tender and demanding, encouraging and critical, full of advice that was not quite framed as advice and expectations that were not quite framed as expectations. Her children learned to read them carefully and respond carefully, which is the epistolary equivalent of walking on a floor, has soft spots. Beatrice's editing, or destruction, of the journals remains one of the more frustrating acts in Victorian historical record-keeping. Beatrice was the youngest child, the one Victoria had kept closest, the one who had nursed her through her final years, and who felt apparently that certain portions of the record required protection, either from history or from other family members. What exactly was removed is unknowable, which is precisely what makes it so maddening. The Victoria who remains in the surviving journals is already complicated enough to suggest that whatever was taken out would have been interesting. The woman who wrote 60,000 letters and kept a diary for 68 years was not someone who left things unrecorded. What Beatrice removed, we will never know. What she left behind is extraordinary enough to make the loss feel genuinely significant. While Victoria managed the European dynastic network from Windsor, her son Bertie married Alexandra of Denmark in 1863, and this particular match added an interesting complication to the family geography. Alexandra's brother later became King George I of Greece, and her sister became Empress of Russia, which meant that the British heirs-in-laws now sat at tables across Europe in ways that occasionally conflicted quite directly with his mother's diplomatic arrangements. Alexandra herself was charming, beloved by the British public in ways that her mother-in-law found both gratifying and, periodically, slightly irritating. The relationship between Victoria and Alexandra was cordial but careful. Two women who understood each other's positions perfectly, and were both far too experienced at court life to say anything that could be used against them. Alexandra arrived in Britain in 1863 to a reception that surprised everyone, including Alexandra. The British public, which had been watching Victoria withdraw into grief for 2 years, and had developed a corresponding hunger for something, warm and present and royal, turned out in numbers that lined the streets from the coast to London. Alexandra was beautiful, genuinely, unusually beautiful, with a grace of movement and an ease with crowds that Bertie's official handlers had not quite dared to hope for. She smiled and waved and seemed genuinely pleased to be there, and the British public, which had been starved of visible royalty for 2 years, responded with an enthusiasm that the more reserved members of Victoria's household found somewhat overwhelming. Victoria approved of the match in principle and found the execution complicated in practice, which was her standard position on most of Bertie's decisions. Alexandra was lovely, yes. Alexandra was popular, yes. Alexandra was also Danish. At a moment when Prussia was in the process of taking Schleswig-Holstein from Denmark by force, a war that Vicky's husband Frederick was fighting on the Prussian side, which meant that Bertie's wife and Vicky's husband were, briefly and uncomfortably, on opposite sides of an active military conflict. Victoria attempted to navigate this with the strained diplomacy of a woman managing a family dinner where half the guests are not speaking to the other half, which is an accurate description of what it was. Alexandra developed, over the decades of her marriage to Bertie, a set of survival strategies that deserve recognition as a form of high art. She was unfailingly gracious in public about Bertie's infidelities, which were numerous and not especially discreet. She cultivated friendships of her own, maintained her own household rhythms, and developed a cheerful social deafness. She had a hereditary condition that affected her hearing, that her family suspected she occasionally deployed strategically when conversations became inconvenient. She raised 5 children largely independently. She maintained close relationships with her Danish family that Victoria sometimes found diplomatically inconvenient, and Alexandra maintained anyway. She was, in short, a woman who had arrived in a difficult position and made something workable of it through a combination of genuine warmth, careful management, and a social intelligence that nobody who dismissed her as merely decorative ever quite accounted for. The final years of Victoria's reign were shadowed by the Second Boer War in South Africa, which began in 1899 and became one of the more uncomfortable episodes in British imperial history. The British Army, expected to deliver a quick and easy victory over the Boer settlers of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, instead spent 2.5 years in a costly grinding conflict that exposed serious problems in military organisation, provoked international condemnation, and introduced the world to the British concentration camp, a term and a practice that the British invented and subsequently tried very hard to walk away from. Victoria herself supported the war vigorously, visited wounded soldiers in hospitals, and sent tins of chocolate to the troops for Christmas. She was 80 years old, going blind, and driving in an open carriage through the snow to cheer people up. Whatever else you say about Victoria, she showed up. The war began in October 1899, and the British public expected it to be over by Christmas, which is a sentence that should sound familiar to anyone who has studied the first few weeks of August 1914. The Boers, Dutch-descended farmers who had been settling southern Africa for generations and who had an extremely practical relationship with firearms and their landscape, turned out to be considerably more formidable opponents than British military planners had anticipated. They fought as guerrillas, moving fast using the terrain and declining to stand still in the neat formations that British military tactics of the period were designed to defeat. The British Army, which had been fighting colonial wars against less well-armed opponents for most of the previous century, was not immediately well adapted to this. The early months of the war produced a series of British defeats that shocked the public and delighted Britain's continental rivals, several of whom had been waiting with considerable patience for evidence that the empire was not as invincible as it presented itself. Germany, France, and Russia all made their private satisfaction clear in ways that were diplomatically contained but not especially well concealed. Victoria, who had spent her reign managing the relationship between British military confidence and political reality, found the early reverses personally distressing. She visited the wounded in hospitals with a frequency and directness that her courtiers found exhausting to organise, and her subjects found genuinely moving. The concentration camps were the aspect of the war that history has found hardest to set aside. As the conventional military phase gave way to guerrilla warfare, the British strategy shifted to denying the Boer fighters the support of their civilian population by removing that population. Boer families were placed in camps that were, initially badly administered, undersupplied and lethal. A British activist named Emily Hobhouse investigated, reported and produced a document that created a political crisis at home and an international one abroad. The death toll in the camps, predominantly women and children, ran to tens of thousands. Victoria died before the worst of this became fully public. Her government managed the crisis with a combination of partial reform and persistent denial that satisfied nobody and resolved nothing permanently. The empire that had paraded through London in 1897 was, by 1901, a more complicated thing than the Jubilee photographs suggested. By the final decade of the 19th century, the scale of Victoria's dynastic network was genuinely staggering. Her children and grandchildren occupied or were married into the ruling families of Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Norway, Sweden, Spain, Denmark, and various German principalities too numerous to individually track without a dedicated chart. The Kaiser of Germany was her grandson. The Tsarina of Russia was her granddaughter. The King of Greece was her son-in-law's brother. The Queen of Norway was her granddaughter. The King of Spain would shortly marry another granddaughter. Victoria sat at the centre of this web like a small black-clad spider, receiving letters from every corner of it, dispensing advice that ranged from genuinely wise to meddlesome, and maintaining a level of awareness about European royal politics that would have been impressive for a professional diplomat, and was extraordinary for an 80-year-old woman running the British Empire from an armchair in Windsor. The network had been built over 40 years, with a consistency of purpose that disguised itself as family correspondence. To read Victoria's letters to her children and grandchildren is to watch a woman simultaneously maintaining emotional relationships and conducting foreign policy through the same medium, often in the same paragraph, occasionally in the same sentence. A letter to Vicky about the children's health would pivot without apparent transition to pointed observations about Prussian military spending. A note to the Tsarina would combine genuine grandmotherly affection with careful intelligence about British parliamentary opinion on Russian expansion. Victoria did not separate the personal from the political, because for her they had never been separate categories. What the network provided in theory was a set of personal relationships between heads of state that cut beneath the formal diplomatic channels. when the Kaiser and the Tsar were exchanging official communiques through ambassadors, they were also exchanging letters through their mutual grandmother, and those letters had a different register, more direct, more emotional, occasionally more honest. Victoria used this register deliberately, saying things in family correspondence that no foreign secretary could have put in an official dispatch. She told the Kaiser when she thought he was being foolish. She told the Tsarina when she thought Russian policy was alarming Britain. She told her prime ministers what she had heard from her grandchildren and expected them to factor it into their calculations. The network's limitation was structural. It could soften friction between governments with personal goodwill between monarchs, but it could not dissolve the competing national interest that drove the friction in the first place. When German naval expansion threatened British security, the fact that the Kaiser adored his grandmother did not change the strategic calculation. It merely added a layer of personal hurt to the diplomatic tension when Britain responded. When Russian expansion into the Balkans alarmed Austria-Hungary, the Tsarina's British grandmother could write concerned letters, but could not alter the logic of Russian imperial ambition. The web Victoria had woven was real, and it mattered, and when she died it frayed faster than anyone had expected. By 1914, the grandsons who had sat together at her deathbed were running the armies that were shooting at each other's soldiers. The network had not failed. It had simply encountered forces larger than family feeling, which is what networks built on personal relationships always eventually encounter. In her final years, Victoria's body began failing her in ways that her will refused to acknowledge. Her eyesight deteriorated severely. She could no longer read state papers herself and relied on having them read aloud to her. Her memory, while still sharp for personal matters, began to blur around the edges of official business. She had difficulty walking and was often in considerable pain. She ate heavily, slept poorly, and spent increasing amounts of time at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, her favourite retreat, the house she and Albert had built together, the place that felt most like a home and least like a symbol. Her family worried. Her doctors worried. Victoria herself refused to behave like someone who was dying, which was consistent with everything else she had ever done, and made the final weeks of her reign both difficult to manage and somehow entirely in character. The eating is worth pausing on, because it is one of those details that Victoria's official biography tends to handle with considerable delicacy, and that more honest accounts acknowledge directly. Victoria ate enormously, and ate fast, a habit formed, apparently from a childhood of communal meals where food was never quite guaranteed to wait for you, and reinforced by a lifetime of state dinners where the Queen's pace set the pace for everyone, which meant that everyone ate at the speed of someone who ate very fast. Course after course would be placed and removed while guests who had barely started their plates watched the next dish arrive. The court developed strategies. The waistline expanded. Victoria's doctors made gentle suggestions about moderation that Victoria received and ignored with equal consistency. The weight affected her mobility, which was already compromised by what appears to have been rheumatic conditions in her joints. By the late 1890s, she was using a wheelchair for longer distances and a walking frame for shorter ones, a fact that the court managed with the practiced discretion of an institution that had spent 60 years making constitutional monarchy look effortless. Public appearances were choreographed to minimise the evidence of physical limitation while preserving the symbolic weight of presence. Victoria was helped in and out of carriages with practice speed. Photographs were managed. The image of the empress endured even as the body beneath. It became increasingly difficult to manage. What remained entirely undiminished was the mind, or at least the will, which in Victoria's case had always been the stronger of the two. She continued to read dispatches, continued to write letters, continued to form opinions and communicate them with the specific authority of someone who understood that the weight behind the words had not diminished just because the body carrying them had. Her final months at Osborne were not the peaceful fade of someone who had made peace with the ending. They were the final chapter of someone who had simply run out of time, which is a different thing entirely. She had things still to say, and people still to manage, and she was managing them until she couldn't. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House, surrounded by her family. She was 81 years old and had been queen for 63 years, the longest reign in British history until her great-great-granddaughter Elizabeth II surpassed it in 2015. Her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was at her bedside when she died, which is a fact that history has the decency to find at least slightly poignant, given what he was about to do to the continent. She was buried beside Albert at Frogmore, in the mausoleum she had built 40 years earlier when he died, and she had never stopped grieving. She had asked to be buried with a cast of Albert's hand, a lock of John Brown's hair, and various other objects of personal significance that were placed in the coffin before it was sealed. The long list of things placed in the coffin was, in itself, a kind of autobiography. The decline had accelerated sharply in the final weeks of January. Victoria had returned to Osborne after Christmas at Windsor, and the telegrams going out from the house in mid-January to her family across Europe had a tone that the recipients understood immediately. The Kaiser came from Berlin. Bertie came from London. Her surviving children gathered. The family that Victoria had spent 60 years dispatching to courts across the continent converged on a house on the Isle of Wight, where a small elderly woman was dying in the bedroom she had shared with Albert and then kept as a shrine to Albert for 40 years afterward. She was conscious intermittently in the final days. She recognised people. She spoke occasionally. The doctors managed her comfort with the tools available to them, which in 1901 were more limited than those available now, but sufficient for the basic task of keeping pain at a manageable level. Wilhelm sat at her bedside for hours. This man who had alarmed Europe, who had dismissed Bismarck, who was in the process of building a navy designed to challenge British supremacy, and held his grandmother's hand with the specific grief of someone who loved a person and knew they were losing the only relationship in their life that had ever fully accepted them. It is one of the stranger images the century produced. She died at 6:30 in the evening, with her family around her. The announcement went out across the empire by telegraph within the hour, and the response was something that people who lived through it described for the rest of their lives as a collective shock that went beyond grief. The sudden awareness that the thing they had assumed was permanent was not. Victoria had been queen for so long that an entire generation had grown up in a world she had defined, and the removal of her presence felt less like a death and more like a structural change. The Victorian era was over. Nobody had entirely decided what came next. The 20th century, which had been waiting politely in the anteroom for 31 days, was now going to make itself known. When Victoria died, the British Empire was the largest in human history. Her descendants sat on the thrones of 9 European countries. The 20th century was 13 days old. 13 years later, those same descendants would be on opposite sides of the worst war Europe had yet seen, the Kaiser's Germany against Tsar Nicholas's Russia, both of them grandchildren of the small German-descended woman who had tried to use marriage to make the continent peaceful. History has a particular kind of cruelty for good intentions. The world Victoria left behind was, by the standards of her own time, an achievement of remarkable scale. By the standards of what came next, it was a powder keg with a very short fuse and an enormous extended family standing dangerously nearby. The irony of Victoria's dynastic strategy is that it worked exactly as designed and produced consequences entirely opposite to those intended. The personal relationships between European monarchs were real. The Kaiser did love his grandmother. The Tsar was genuinely connected through Alexandra to the British royal family in ways that went beyond diplomatic courtesy. The web of letters and visits and family gatherings that Victoria had maintained across 40 years had created a set of human bonds that crossed national boundaries with a ease that no formal diplomatic institution could replicate. And none of it was enough, not nearly enough, when the structural forces driving European nations toward conflict finally reached the point where personal feeling could no longer hold them. The British Empire that Victoria left behind was the most powerful single political entity on Earth, governing roughly 400 million people across every inhabited continent. It was also, by 1901, beginning to show the strains of that scale in ways that the Diamond Jubilee had decorated over but not resolved. The Boer War had revealed military weaknesses. The industrial competition of Germany and the United States was eroding the commercial supremacy that had underwritten British power for a century. The political movements, nationalist, socialist, suffragist, that would define the coming decades were already visible and growing. Victoria's Britain was still the world's dominant power. It was no longer unquestionably so, and the people running it knew it, even when they declined to say it directly. What survived Victoria most cleanly was the institution she had spent 63 years inhabiting, the British monarchy itself, which she had taken as a young, uncertain girl in a dressing gown, and returned as a symbol of such durability that her successors would spend the next century managing the expectation she'd created. She had defined what a modern constitutional monarchy could look like, simultaneously powerful and restrained, symbolic and functional, personal and institutional, in ways that proved more durable than any of her specific political achievements. The empire she governed mostly collapsed within 50 years of her death. The monarchy she embodied endured. That asymmetry is, perhaps, the clearest measure of where her real legacy lay. Here is the question history keeps returning to. Was Victoria the architect of her era, or was she the symbol of it? The answer is probably both, and in proportions that shifted over the course of 63 years. In the early decades, she was a genuine political force, shaping policy, directing correspondence, influencing appointments, pushing back against prime ministers she disliked, and embracing those she trusted. In the decades after Albert's death, she became something more complex, a symbol of continuity so powerful that the mere fact of her continued existence seemed to hold things together. The Victorians believed, with some justification, that civilization was advancing, that science and commerce and empire and moral seriousness were building a world better than the one before it. Victoria was the human face of that belief, even when the evidence was complicated, and even when the empire that bore her name was doing things her official portraits declined to depict. She was not flawless. She was not always wise. But she was, for 81 years, undeniably present, and presence in a monarch is not nothing. The Victorians named their era after her, which is either the greatest honour history can offer a person or a very heavy thing to carry, depending on your perspective. The Victorian era is now shorthand for a set of values: industriousness, moral seriousness, imperial confidence, domestic propriety, that are simultaneously real and oversimplified. Real, because these values did shape the culture that produced them. Oversimplified, because the era that named itself for a single woman was also the era of Charles Dickens writing about children dying in workhouses, of Florence Nightingale reinventing medical care in field hospitals, of suffragists beginning the long argument for women's votes, of Karl Marx sitting in the British Museum writing about the contradictions of capitalism. The Victorian era contained its own critiques, its own resistance, its own evidence that the official story was incomplete. Victoria presided over all of it, which means her legacy is as complicated as the century that bears her name. What she did, concretely, is easier to list. She reigned through 7 prime ministers and 10 governments. She presided over the expansion of the British Empire to its greatest ever extent. She oversaw the Reform Acts that expanded the British electorate toward genuine democracy. She survived 8 assassination attempts, a husband's death, a son's scandals, a granddaughter's assassination, and the collapse of the alliance system she had spent 40 years building. She wrote 60,000 letters and 40,000 pages of journals and never apparently ran out of things to say. She had 9 children who produced 42 grandchildren, who produced 87 great-grandchildren, and she kept track of all of them with a thoroughness that would be impressive in someone with nothing else to do. What she was, underneath all of it, was a person, stubborn, loving, occasionally petty, genuinely courageous, capable of extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary obstinacy in roughly equal measure, who had been handed an impossible job at 18 and done it for 63 years without once asking whether she wanted to. She hadn't been given the option of wanting or not wanting. She'd simply been queen every single day, from the morning she came downstairs in a dressing gown at Kensington Palace until the evening she died at Osborne House with her family around her, and a cast of Albert's hand in the coffin. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. By the summer of 1914, 3 of Victoria's grandchildren were running 3 of the most powerful empires on earth, and they were about to go to war with each other. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain had all sat together at Victoria's deathbed 13 years earlier. They had played together as children at Osborne and Balmoral. They had written each other letters that began with nicknames, Willie, Nicky, Georgie, with the casual familiarity of men who had grown up in the same extended family and knew each other's childhood embarrassments. And in August 1914, their armies marched to the borders and began shooting at each other's soldiers with an industrial efficiency that the 19th century had built and the 20th century was about to demonstrate at full scale. If Victoria had lived to see it, she didn't. Thankfully, it would have been the most complete possible refutation of everything she had spent 40 years trying to build. The 3 cousins had been aware in the years leading up to 1914 that the tensions between their countries were serious. The letters between them, Nicky and Willie in particular, maintained a direct correspondence that their foreign ministries found alternately useful and alarming, showmen who understood that the machinery of alliance and mobilization was building towards something, and who were simultaneously unable and unwilling to stop it. Wilhelm was driven by a mixture of genuine alarm about German strategic encirclement and personal insecurity that expressed itself as aggression. Nicholas was driven by the specific paralysis of a decent man in an impossible position, watching events accelerate while lacking the authority or the clarity to redirect them. George, whose position was constitutionally more limited than either of his cousins, watched from London as the continent moved toward catastrophe, with the specific anguish of someone who can see what is coming and cannot find the lever to stop it. The July crisis of 1914, the 5 weeks between the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of general war, produced a flurry of direct telegrams between Nicky and Willie that are among the most haunting documents the century produced. The 2 men addressed each other with the warmth of cousins and the strained formality of heads of state who have run out of personal solutions to political problems. They called each other by their childhood names. They expressed hope. They described the situation as having moved beyond their individual control, which was true and was also in its way an abdication. Victoria had believed that personal relationships between monarchs could substitute for, or at least supplement, the formal mechanisms of diplomatic management. The Nicky Willie telegrams are the evidence that she was wrong, that when structural forces reach sufficient pressure, personal affection becomes insufficient ballast. The cousins who had grown up together sent their armies against each other anyway. The grandmother who had tried to prevent this by arranging their marriages was 14 years in her grave, and the network she had built was coming apart at every seam, simultaneously. George V, watching from London, made one decision in those final weeks that history has noted with a particular kind of irony. The British royal family's name was Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, Albert's German family name, carried forward through Victoria's descendants. In 1917, with Britain 3 years into a war with Germany and anti-German sentiment running at maximum intensity, George changed the family name to Windsor. The German name that Victoria had carried into the British throne was quietly retired. The house that Albert had built, renamed to survive a war that Albert's grandson had started. Victoria would have found this unbearable. She would also probably have understood it completely. There is a version of Victoria that official portraiture and state ceremony entirely obscures, and it lives in Scotland. Specifically, it lives in the Highlands, in a castle on the River Dee in Aberdeenshire, surrounded by mountains and heather and a landscape so completely different from Windsor or Buckingham Palace that arriving there must have felt every time like stepping out of one life and into another. Victoria loved Balmoral with a completeness that she brought to very few things outside of Albert and her children. She loved it with her whole self, the cold air, the long walks, the informality, the sense of being in a place where the weight of empire was temporarily replaced by the weight of weather, and the specific, satisfying exhaustion of physical activity in large spaces. She first visited Scotland in 1842 and spent the rest of her life trying to get back there as often as possible. Balmoral, which she and Albert purchased and rebuilt in the 1850s, became the closest thing to a home the British monarchy possessed. Not a palace, not a symbol, but an actual place where people lived rather than performed. The Scottish holidays were not universally popular with Victoria's government. Ministers, who needed to consult the Queen during the Balmoral seasons, found the journey from London inconvenient in the specific way that things are inconvenient when the person making them inconvenient is the Queen of England and you cannot say so directly. Dispatch boxes travelled north by train. Ministers followed when summoned. The telegraphs hummed between Aberdeenshire and Whitehall with a regularity that suggests Victoria never entirely stopped working, even when she was, theoretically, on holiday. But the pace was different. The formality was different. Victoria walked miles through the hills with a freedom that London never permitted. The security concerns managed, as always, through a combination of loyalty in the local population and the specific quality of Highland landscape, which discouraged casual intrusion through sheer geographic inconvenience. Albert had loved Scotland too, which deepened Victoria's attachment after his death in ways that were both genuine and her family occasionally felt slightly excessive. She continued the Highland traditions they had established together, the games, the gillies balls, the long pony rides through the hills, with a faithfulness that was partly grief and partly genuine pleasure, and partly the stubborn conviction that maintaining the patterns they had built together was a form of keeping him present. John Brown had been part of Balmoral before he was part of Windsor, which explained something about why his role in Victoria's life began where it did and had the quality it had. Scotland was where Victoria was least offended, and Brown had met her there first. She wrote about Scotland with a lyrical directness that her official writing entirely lacks, describing the colours of the heather, the sound of the river, the quality of light in late afternoon, the feeling of cold air on her face during long rides. She published 2 books about her Highland life, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands and More, Leaves, that were bestsellers and that her more sophisticated subjects found embarrassingly enthusiastic, and her broader public found entirely charming. The books are what they are, the unguarded writing of a woman describing a place she loved, without the careful management that shaped everything else she put on paper. That unguardedness is, in itself, a form of revelation. The woman who ran the world's largest empire wrote her most honest sentences about the view from a Scottish hillside, which tells you something true about where Victoria actually lived, even when she was required to be somewhere else. Here is something that the official record of Victoria's reign underrepresents significantly: the women. Not Victoria herself, she is everywhere in the record inescapably. But the women around her, the ones whose labour and loyalty and intelligence made the machinery of the court function, and whose names appear in footnotes when they appear at all, the ladies-in-waiting, the maids, of honour, the governesses, the dressers, women who spent their professional lives in intimate proximity to the most powerful woman in the world, and whose own lives were almost entirely subsumed into the service of hers, and beyond the court, the women of Victoria's era who were doing things that the era officially did not expect of them, inventing professions, building institutions, arguing for rights that Victoria herself was publicly ambivalent about, and privately, depending on the day, either more sympathetic toward or less sympathetic toward than her public position suggested. Victoria's relationship with the question of women's rights is one of the more genuinely complex aspects of her public record, partly because she embodied the argument for women's capability more completely than almost any other figure of her century, and simultaneously declined to endorse the political conclusions that seemed to follow. She was a woman who had run an empire for 63 years. She had overruled prime ministers, shaped foreign policy, survived assassinations, managed a continental dynastic network, and written the equivalent of several libraries' worth of correspondence. The argument that women were incapable of public responsibility was, in her person, comprehensively refuted every single day. And yet she expressed opposition to women's suffrage in terms that her supporters found baffling, and her opponents found useful. The explanation that makes most sense is also the most uncomfortable one. Victoria's power had come to her through an accident of birth, and a system that made exceptions for queens while maintaining its general rules for women. She had never had to argue for her authority. She had simply had it, and she had used it. And the gap between her own experience and the experience of women who needed to argue for basic civic participation may genuinely have been invisible to her, in the way that large gaps are sometimes invisible to people who have always been on the privileged side of them. She was not cruel about it. She was simply, in this particular area, a product of her limitations rather than her capacities. The women who surrounded her were often more quietly radical than their positions allowed them to express. Baroness Letson, Victoria's beloved governess, had shaped a queen's character with the patience and consistency of someone who understood that influence operates over decades rather than moments. Florence Nightingale, not a court figure but deeply embedded in Victorian public life, had built a profession and reformed a system while being officially a woman in a society that did not give women official positions from which to build professions and reform systems. She did it anyway. Mary Seacole had done similar work in the Crimea with less official recognition and more personal obstacle. Eleanor Vere Gordon managed Victoria's correspondence with a competence that the official record attributes to the Secretariat rather than its members. The women of Victoria's era ran things from positions that the era declined to name, which is a historical pattern so consistent that pointing it out risks becoming repetitive. But repetition, in this case, is the point. The most remarkable woman of the 19th century was surrounded her entire life by remarkable women. The era was full of them. History is still catching up.